So it's been a couple days now. So I wanted to talk about the whole Scott Cochran from Alabama to Georgia thing because I swear the focus has been so misplaced on this. Everyone's so focused because it's February, because you got to generate some clicks. Everyone wants to engage you with the Alabama versus Georgia angle. Everyone wants to engage you with that's Kirby Smart versus Nick Saban angle. That's wonderful. And I love when they play on the field, and spoiler alert, they will this September. What I'm focused on has nothing to do with anyone stealing anything from Alabama or even how Alabama and Nick Saban will fill Scott Cochran's position, because between you and me, I think they'll fill it pretty adequately. What I'm focused on, a couple of facets, they both have to do with Georgia. Number one, admittedly, this is sort of a risk that Kirby Smart's taking here. Now, he knows better than anyone. We were talking to Jake Rowe from Dogs 24/7, and he said it as well as I could. Only Kirby Smart really knows how big a risk this is, because only Kirby Smart is really uniquely aware of how qualified Scott Cochran is and how ready he is to be an on-field coach. I don't know that, though. So from my perspective, it's still somewhat of a risk, but that we can worry about in spring ball, and that we can worry about down the road when fall camp opens and it's week 6 and it's tied in the fourth quarter with a key opponent. What I want to look at is the recruiting angle. Here's where a lot of folks were misguided by my estimation the other day. A lot of folks, when I said this is a recruiting move and a recruiting move A, B, and C, then you can get to the rest down the list, they said, well, I mean, Georgia, what in the world are they going to do? Finish higher than #1 in the recruiting rankings? Because they did just lock down the #1 team ranking in the 24/7 Sports rankings on our last signing day. That's wonderful. A lot of people mistakenly look at that and say they can't do any better. Well, that's not Kirby Smart's mentality. And it's a 1% versus a 99% mentality. I get that. Not a lot of people are wired the same way as an elite D1 head coach is. But Kirby Smart is that. So let me tell you how he looks at this. Kirby Smart is not interested in whether he's going to beat Missouri by 34 points or 38 points or 42 points. That's not who he's competing against. Georgia's not competing, with all due respect, against Missouri. Kirby Smart knows that there's a pot of about half a dozen teams right now that any given year, if they're on, are capable of winning a national championship. He's one of them. They hadn't gotten it done yet. Let me remind people, there is no complacency because they haven't won a championship yet. Bama's in this mix. LSU, of course, now is in this mix. Ohio State, Clemson. I mean, essentially, Oklahoma. These are the teams that you're talking about competing against at Georgia, even if they're not on your regular season schedule. Here's what Smart knows. When he looks around at Ohio State playing Clemson, when he has played Alabama, when he looks at national championship games, they're competitive, guys. Every one of these teams, every one of these programs are loading their rosters up with elite kids. That's just the starting point. You got to recruit like that just to be in the conversation. You don't recruit like that, you're not in the conversation. Georgia recruits like that. They're in the conversation now. But I want you to think about something. If you don't believe that the Cochran hire was about recruiting first and foremost, I want you to remember Georgia already had a loaded roster this last year. You ask me what difference a few more 5-stars could make? Well, I pulled up Georgia's schedule, and I wanted to know if my memory served me correctly, and it did. Georgia last year, do you remember the Texas A&M game late in the year? Do you remember the Florida game? You remember the South Carolina game? You remember the Auburn game? There were like 5 games. That's almost half your schedule, guys, that were one-possession wins for Georgia. They got blown out by LSU, but even in their wins, you ask me, what would 1 or 2 more players mean? Well, what if they didn't have 1 or 2 players in those games? Guys, I mean, one bounce of the ball in any one of those games, and it goes different. So you view them as having arrived for some reason just because they're recruiting at a high level. Kirby Smart's not interested in competing or comparing with Alabama or Clemson. He wants to rip their head off. He wants to paint the walls with their blood. He wants to dominate. He wants to have a roster so physically superior that they have to screw something up in order for someone else to beat them. And right now, that's not quite where they are. So you think they couldn't get any better. I think, and he thinks, more importantly, they could get a lot better. But I want you to think about this for a second. I want you to look around, and I want you to consider in the past, 2017, for example, because this is the way a Kirby Smart thinks. 2017, Alabama, Georgia, national championship, we all know how it ends, 2nd and 26. So I think to myself back then, what would one more elite edge rusher in the fourth quarter and or overtime have meant? What would one more elite defensive back, instead of just a very good one, have meant? Potentially the difference between having nothing on your shelf in the last 30 or 40 years and having a brand spanking new national championship trophy on your shelf. Make no mistake. The Scott Cochran hire is about recruiting. And I get a sneaking suspicion that when we get into November, a lot of Georgia fans are going to look and say, you know what, in retrospect, I really love the Scott Cochran hire. Here's the part B, though. I think a lot of folks in Tuscaloosa are going to look at whoever they end up hiring, and they're going to look at their result and say, boy, you remember how worked up a lot of people, including some of us, got in February when Scott Cochran left? When's the last time we talked about Scott Cochran? I think it's going to be an addition, and I think it's going to be a net increase and a positive for both programs. So I may be in the minority. That's where I stand on Scott Cochran in Georgia.